Picture a land in flames, its fields reduced to smoldering ash, its villages erased from existence, and its rivers poisoned by the very hands that were sworn to protect it. This was Wallachia in the spring of 1462, a small but defiant principality caught in the shadow of the Ottoman Empire, the most formidable power of the age. At its helm stood Mehmed II, the Sultan who had shattered the walls of Constantinople 9 years earlier, a conqueror whose ambition knew no bounds. His target, Vlad III, voivode of Wallachia, a man whose name would echo through history as Vlad the Impaler. What kind of ruler would set fire to his own homeland, sacrificing his people's homes, crops, and livelihoods to defy an empire? Vlad was no ordinary leader. He was a visionary of terror, a strategist who turned desperation into a weapon, wielding cruelty with a precision that would haunt his enemies for centuries. As Mehmed's army, a juggernaut of 90,000 men, crossed the Danube into Wallachia, they anticipated a glorious clash, banners unfurled, swords gleaming, and a defiant prince leading his troops to meet them in open battle. Instead, they stepped into a wasteland, a desolate realm crafted by Vlad's own ruthless hand. The fields that once fed Wallachia's people were blackened, reduced to cinders by fires that burned day and night. Granaries stood empty or smoldered in ruins, their contents scattered to the winds or buried in ash. Livestock, cows, sheep, and horses had been slaughtered in their pens or driven deep into the Carpathian Mountains, far beyond the reach of Ottoman foragers. Even the wells, the lifeblood of any army, were poisoned with rot or filled with debris, offering nothing but death to those who sought to drink. This was no act of madness or despair. It was a calculated act of defiance, a strategy born from necessity. Vlad's forces, numbering perhaps 30,000 at their peak, were a mere fraction of Mehmed's vast army. A conventional battle would have been suicide, a fleeting stand that would have left Wallachia crushed beneath the Ottoman heel. Instead, Vlad chose a different path, one that turned his homeland into a weapon. According to the Byzantine chronicler Laonikos Chalkokondyles, whose accounts provide a vivid window into this campaign, Vlad ordered the systematic destruction of everything that could sustain an invading force. Entire villages were razed, their inhabitants evacuated to remote strongholds, or in some cases, sacrificed to deny the Ottomans any advantage. The land itself became a silent ally, a barren trap that starved, demoralized, and disoriented the invaders. In a letter to Matthias Corvinus, King of Hungary, preserved in the Hungarian National Archives, Vlad laid bare his brutal strategy with chilling clarity. "I have killed peasants, men and women, old and young, from the Danube to the mountains. We have burned everything, leaving no shelter, no food, no hope for the enemy." These were not the words of a ruler lamenting loss, but of a commander embracing annihilation as a tool of war. Entire communities were uprooted, their homes reduced to ash to ensure the Ottomans found no refuge. Scouts sent to gather intelligence returned with nothing but tales of desolation. Foragers, desperate for supplies, wandered through ghost towns where the only sound was the wind howling through charred ruins. The Ottoman army, accustomed to the spoils of conquest, began to falter. Far from their supply lines, they faced a landscape that offered no sustenance. Disease spread through their ranks, carried by the stagnant air and tainted water. Hunger gnawed at their strength, and despair crept into their hearts. Soldiers, hardened by years of warfare, began to whisper curses of a land that rejected their presence. Some abandoned their posts, fleeing into the unknown rather than face the relentless hostility of Wallachia's scorched earth. This was not the warfare Mehmed had known in his conquests of Byzantium or the Balkans. This was something new, a battle without swords, a victory won through absence. Vlad had turned Wallachia into a graveyard for Ottoman ambitions, and this was only the beginning of his campaign of terror. But the scorched earth was more than a military tactic. It was a statement of resolve. Vlad knew the cost of his actions, the suffering of his own people, the destruction of their homes and livelihoods. Yet he embraced it, believing that only through such sacrifice could Wallachia endure. His subjects, caught between loyalty to their voivode and the devastation of their land, faced an impossible choice. Some fled to the mountains, joining guerrilla bands that harried Ottoman stragglers. Others remained, their lives upended by a ruler who saw their sacrifice as the price of defiance. To Vlad, every burned village was a blow against the Sultan. Every poisoned well a step toward victory. His people suffered, but so too did the invaders, and in this grim calculus, Vlad found his strength. As the Ottomans pressed deeper into Wallachia, they began to understand the true nature of their foe. This was no mere prince defending his territory. This was a man who would burn his world to ashes rather than surrender it. The scorched earth was only the first act in Vlad's campaign, a prelude to a war that would test the limits of human endurance and redefine the meaning of terror. What lay ahead would shake even the mightiest warriors of the Ottoman Empire. For Vlad Tepes was not content to starve his enemies. He intended to break their very souls. The summer of 1462 brought no relief to Mehmed II's weary army. As they marched deeper into Wallachia, the desolation of Vlad's scorched earth campaign gave way to a new kind of horror, one that would sear itself into the memories of all who witnessed it. At the gates of Targovishte, Wallachia's fortified capital, the Ottomans encountered a sight that defied comprehension. A forest of stakes, each crowned with the remains of their comrades, their allies, and even their envoys. This was no battlefield littered with the fallen. It was a meticulously crafted spectacle, a gallery of death designed to paralyze the invaders with fear. Vlad Tepes, the Impaler, had turned his cruelty into an art form, and the stakes of Targovishte were his masterpiece. Impalement was not a punishment unique to Vlad. It existed across the medieval world, from the courts of Europe to the battlefields of the Ottoman Empire. But Vlad elevated it to a level of calculated terror never seen before. From 1456 to 1462, during his turbulent reign, he refined impalement into a public performance of power, a weapon of statecraft that instilled fear in enemies and subjects alike. The process was gruesome. A long wooden stake, carefully sharpened but not too finely, was driven through the victim's body, often from the lower torso upward, sometimes exiting through the chest or shoulders. The stake was designed to prolong suffering, ensuring that the victim remained alive sometimes for hours or days as a living testament to Vlad's wrath. At Targovishte, the scale of this horror was staggering. Chroniclers Antonio Bonfini and Leonikos Chalkokondyles describe a scene of unimaginable brutality. Approximately 20,000 captives, primarily Ottoman prisoners but also Wallachian subjects accused of disloyalty, were impaled and arranged in symmetrical rows outside the city. The stakes were not scattered haphazardly, but positioned with precision, forming patterns that stretched across the landscape like a macabre orchard. Some bodies were fresh, their blood still staining the earth. Others were weathered, their forms decaying under the summer sun. This was not merely execution, it was a message, a declaration that Wallachia would not bow. Among the impaled were high-ranking Ottoman envoys, sent by Mehmed to negotiate terms before the invasion. According to a 15th-century Saxon chronicle from Brasov, these messengers committed a fatal error. They refused to remove their turbans in Vlad's presence, citing religious custom. Vlad's response was swift and merciless. "If their customs are so sacred," he reportedly declared, "let them be nailed to their heads." Their turbans were affixed with iron spikes, and their bodies were hoisted onto stakes at the city gates. While the exact wording of this exchange remains debated, the event is corroborated by both Saxon and Slavic sources, underscoring Vlad's intolerance for defiance, even from those who claimed diplomatic immunity. The roads leading to Târgoviște, Bucharest, and other Wallachian strongholds were similarly adorned. Stakes lined the paths, some bearing the remains of Ottoman scouts caught in ambushes, others displaying Wallachian traitors or criminals who had crossed Vlad's strict code of justice. The Venetian ambassador to Buda, whose dispatches provide a chilling account of the campaign, described how these displays were intended not just to repel, but to terrify. Ottoman chronicler Tursun Bey, who accompanied Mehmed's army, recorded the impact. Even the Sultan's most seasoned warriors, men who had stormed the walls of Constantinople, recoiled in horror. Some refused to advance, whispering of demons and curses. Others fell to their knees, their morale shattered by a sight that defied the rules of warfare. The psychological toll was immense. Mehmed, the conqueror who had brought empires to their knees, halted his advance before Târgoviște. Tursun Bey wrote that the Sultan was visibly shaken, his usual stoicism giving way to unease. In a rare moment of candor, Mehmed reportedly remarked, "How can we defeat a man who wields such cruelty against his enemies and his own people?" The forest of the impaled was not just a barrier. It was a challenge, a taunt to the Ottoman Empire's might. Vlad had turned death into a weapon, using the bodies of his foes to proclaim his defiance. But impalement was more than a wartime tactic. Within Wallachia, Vlad used it to enforce a draconian code of order. Theft, dishonesty, and betrayal were met with the same brutal punishment, regardless of the offender's status. The Saxon chronicler Michael Beheim recounts a chilling tale of a woman impaled for lying about her husband's labor to avoid work, an offense Vlad deemed a threat to civic virtue. To his enemies, impalement was terror. To Vlad, it was justice, a means to forge a disciplined society in a land perpetually threatened by external powers. His subjects lived in fear, but they also lived in order, knowing that any transgression could lead to the stake. The forest of Târgoviște was a turning point in the campaign. The Ottoman army, already weakened by hunger and disease, found its resolve crumbling. Soldiers deserted in droves, unable to face a land that seemed to curse their every step. Mehmed, accustomed to decisive victories, was forced to confront a foe who fought not with armies, but with the very fabric of fear. Yet Vlad's campaign was far from over. The scorched earth and the forest of stakes were only the prelude to his most insidious tactic, a strategy that would send living nightmares back to the Sultan's camp. As the Ottoman campaign faltered in the summer of 1462, Vlad Tepes unveiled his most chilling weapon yet: the survivors. These were not men spared out of mercy, but transformed into instruments of terror, living proof of the impaler's unrelenting resolve. In a war defined by scorched earth and forests of stakes, Vlad's decision to release select Ottoman captives mutilated, scarred, and broken was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. These men were not meant to fight again. They were meant to carry Vlad's message back to Mehmed II, a message written in blood and fear. According to Slavic chronicles, including the Skazani o Dracula Voivode, the tale of Prince Dracula, Vlad's treatment of these captives was as precise as it was horrifying. Eyes were gouged out, leaving men to stumble blindly through the wilderness. Noses and ears were severed, marking them as outcasts even among their own ranks. Some were branded with hot irons, their skin etched with symbols that mocked Ottoman culture or proclaimed Vlad's dominance. Others had limbs crippled, their bodies twisted into grotesque parodies of the soldiers they once were. These acts were not random cruelty, but carefully orchestrated punishments, designed to instill terror in the Sultan's army and destabilize its morale. The survivors were released with a purpose: to return to their camps as walking warnings. Their mutilated forms spoke louder than any scroll or herald could. To an army already battered by starvation, disease, and the horrors of Târgoviște, these men were a living nightmare, proof that Vlad's cruelty knew no bounds. Some historians suggest that Vlad targeted Muslim prisoners with specific punishments to provoke religious outrage, though this interpretation is not universally supported. What is clear, from both Slavic and Ottoman sources, is that these acts were meant to humiliate as much as to terrify. Vlad branded some captives with symbols of his own Christian faith, others with marks that mocked Ottoman honor. Each scar was a proclamation, each maimed body a challenge to Mehmed's imperial pride. The impact was devastating. Ottoman chroniclers, including Tursun Bey, describe how these survivors sowed panic in the ranks. Soldiers who had faced death in battle were unprepared for the sight of their comrades, broken and disfigured, stumbling back from Wallachia's heart. Whispers of Vlad's sorcery spread, with some claiming he was no mere man, but a demon cloaked in human form. Morale, already fragile, collapsed entirely in some units. Desertion surged, and Mehmed's officers struggled to maintain order among men who feared not just defeat, but the unimaginable fate awaiting them in Wallachia. This strategy of mutilation and release was not new to Vlad. Throughout his reign, he had used terror to enforce his rule, both against external enemies and within his own borders. Impalement was his signature, but mutilation was its companion, a means to extend his reach beyond the battlefield. By sending these scarred survivors back to Mehmed, Vlad ensured that his terror campaign would haunt the Ottoman army long after they left Wallachia's borders. Unlike the dead, who could be buried and forgotten, these men carried Vlad's message in their very flesh, a reminder of the Impaler's power. To Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, this was more than a military setback. It was an insult to his imperial legacy. A ruler who returned his enemies in pieces was not just defying Ottoman might. He was proclaiming that he feared no reprisal. Vlad's maimed captives were not accidents, but deliberate acts of statecraft, each one a testament to his unyielding resolve. They were not fighters returning to battle. They were heralds of despair, their broken bodies shouting what words could not. Wallachia would not fall easily. Vlad Tepes's campaign of 1462 was a masterclass in unconventional warfare. Through scorched earth, he starved the Ottoman body. Through forests of stakes, he broke their spirit. Through maimed survivors, he sowed terror in their hearts. Each tactic built on the last, creating a crescendo of fear that forced even Mehmed II, the conqueror of empires, to hesitate. The campaign did not destroy the Ottoman army, but it wounded its pride and stalled its advance, buying Wallachia precious time to regroup and resist. Vlad's legacy is a paradox. a ruler who saved his people by sacrificing them, who defended his land by destroying it. His methods were brutal, his morality questionable, but his effectiveness undeniable. He reshaped Balkan resistance, proving that a small principality could challenge an empire through sheer audacity and terror. Which of Vlad's tactics struck the deepest blow to the Ottoman psyche? The scorched villages that left them starving, the staked captives that shattered their courage, or the maimed survivors who carried his terror back to their camps? Share your thoughts below. In the end, Vlad's message was not carved in stone or written in ink. It was etched in ash, blood, and fear, a legacy that lingers in the shadow of the Impaler.